It was past midnight. The weight of the night pressed heavily on my chest, refusing to let me rest after tossing and turning in bed for what felt like an eternity. I finally gave up sliding the blanket off me. I sat up, the silence of the apartment thick, and suffocating my throat felt dry. Maybe some water would help. I padded softly to the kitchen, my feet making barely a sound against the cold floor. The dim glow from the living room lights cast elongated shadows, the walls distorting the familiar shapes into something almost ghostly. I shivered not from the cold, but from a strange, unshakable feeling of unease. Everything about this night felt heavier than usual, as if the very air carried the weight of unspoken emotions, secrets left lingering in the darkness. And then there was Mark. Daniel had called me. Earlier that evening, his voice though steady carried a tension that I wasn't used to, hearing from my older brother CLA. He had said, pausing as if searching for the right words, "I need you to do something for me." The request wasn't unreasonable, but the urgency in his tone unsettled me when he told me about Mark. My heart clenched. I had heard of him before, mostly in passing, just a name that occasionally came up in conversations during family gatherings, but we had never been close, and yet the pain in Daniel's voice made it clear this was serious. Mark wasn't just hurting, he was shattered. His wife had betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. After years of marriage, of trust and devotion, she had cast him aside as if he were nothing. The revelation had blindsided him, left him hollow. And so Daniel had asked me no, pleaded with me to take him in, to offer him a place to breathe, to find some semblance of peace. Now as I stood in the dimly lit kitchen, I could feel his presence even without seeing him. Mark was in the guest room, alone with his pain. I wondered if he was sleeping or if he too lay awake drowning in thoughts he wished he could escape. I filled a glass with water, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the only sound breaking the silence as I took a sip. I found myself thinking about what it meant to be betrayed, to have the foundation of your life ripped away in an instant. What would that do to someone? How did you pick up the pieces after something? Like that, a soft creak echoed from down the hall. My heart jumped. Slightly I turned, and there he was. Mark stood in the doorway of the hallway, his posture stiff, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked at me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The weight of his sorrow was almost tangible, an invisible force filling the space. "Between us can't sleep?" I asked softly. Breaking the silence, he exhaled, running a hand through his dishevelled hair. Notorially, his voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken. In hours I nodded, offering a small understanding smile. Me neither. He hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, his presence uncertain, as if he weren't sure whether he belonged here or anywhere at all. I gestured to the other glass on the counter, silently offering him some water. He took it, his fingers brushing against mine for the briefest moment. There was something profoundly fragile about him, something that made my chest ache. He wasn't just hurt, he was lost, drifting in the wreckage of a life he no longer recognized. And as we stood there in the quiet of the night, two strangers, bound by the circumstances of heartbreak, I realized something. This wasn't just about giving him a place to stay. It was about offering him something far more elusive. Hope loss was no stranger to me. It had settled into my bones, woven itself into the fabric of my existence. 7 years had passed since I lost Andrew Tower. Sudden heart attack, yet time had done little to dull the ache. One moment we were laughing over morning, coffee sketching plans for the home we had always dreamed of, and the next I was alone, standing in the ruins of a future that would never be. Grief had not arrived as a storm, but as a slow creeping tide, pulling me under, inch by inch, the weight of his. Absence had grown heavier with each passing year, and lately it had felt unbearable, pressing into me like an unseen force that refused to relent tonight. The silence of the house was different. It wasn't the quiet of solitude that I had grown accustomed to. It was a shared quiet one that belonged to two people, but felt just as lonely. As I stepped into the dimly lit living room, I saw Mark sitting on the couch, his gaze fixed on the television. A romantic movie played, its soft glow casting shifting shadows across his face. He looked exhausted, his usually composed expression marred by something raw, something that made him seem so unlike himself. He noticed me. Before I could turn back, his tired eyes met mine, reflecting something unspoken, something we both carried. But never voiced did I wake you? He asked, his voice low, uncertain. I shook my head, offering Asmal weary smile. No, just needed some water. I hesitated, lingering in the doorway. Mark wasn't just a guest in my home, he was someone who understood he too carried. Ghosts of his own, though, we never spoke of them directly. Perhaps that was why his presence. Though Foreign first had started to feel oddly familiar, he gestured toward the couch. Assolent invitation. I hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. My bare feet against the wooden floor sitting beside him, I felt the weight of our respective grief settle between us, unspoken but tangible on the screen. The lovers in the movie embraced their faces, full of hope, a pang of something sharp twisted inside me, nostalgia, longing, maybe even resent toward the kind of love that never had to reckon with. Lost Mark exhaled a slow, measured breath. He never watched these kinds of movies, he admitted. Too much pretending, I nodded, understanding, sometimes pretending I see Asia. He turned to look at me. His expression unreadable for a moment. It felt like the air between us had shifted, like we were standing at the edge of something fragile and undefined. I wasn't sure if I was ready to step forward or if he was either. But for now it didn't matter. We sat there in silence, letting the echoes of loss speak for us. Right, something truthfully. I didn't want to go back to bed. My room, once familiar and safe, felt unbearably empty tonight. The silence was too loud, pressing in from all sides. Maybe spending some time with Mark would make it feel less suffocating. Maybe. Watching a movie together would remind me that peace was still possible. Even if only for a little while. Come sit. Mark said, patting the empty space beside him. I hesitated, but the alternative, being alone with my thoughts, felt worse. I sat down, careful, to leave enough distance between us, a safe distance, but as the movie played, my attention began to drift on the screen. A couple slowly leaned toward each other, their hands brushing in that hesitant electric way that spoke of something unspoken, something inevitable. A weight settled in, my chest. Memories I had worked so hard to bury stirred, rising to the surface with startling clarity. I turned my head, slightly, maybe just to escape the scene, unfolding in front of me, and by accident, my arm brushed against. Mark's. The touch was fleeting, barely there, and yet I recoiled instinctively. Sorry, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. My eyes dropped to my hands, fingers twisting together in my lap. Mark didn't move. He didn't pull away, didn't shift to reclaim the space between us. Instead, after a pause, he spoke. It's okay, just 3 simple words, but somehow they change. Everything, the distance I had carefully maintained, suddenly felt smaller, more fragile. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of things left. Unsaid, lost, betrayal. Longing, the years that had stretched between us, didn't feel like a barrier anymore. They felt like an echo, something still present, still lingering in the quiet. The movie continued, but neither of us were really watching anymore. The tension, invisible but undeniable, wrapped around us like a shadow. And that night, despite sitting side by side, neither of us truly found peace. The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting soft golden hues across the wooden floor. Yet despite the warmth of the new day, an unsettling weight still clung to my chest. The night before had been restless, filled with echoes of memories, shadows of conversations I could no longer have, no matter how much time passed. The silence of loss remained deafening, seeking solace. I gravitated towards the piano. My sanctuary music had always been my refuge, a place emotions found a voice. When words failed me more than that, it had been our refuge, mine and Andrew's. I could still see him leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, a gentle smile playing on his lips as he listened to me. It was in those quiet moments that we felt most connected, as if the melodies themselves were an unspoken language between us. I let my fingers hover over the keys, exhaling softly before pressing. Down the first note resonated through the room, a single breath of sound filling the emptiness, then another and another. Slowly, a melody began to take shape, one of longing, of remembrance. My eyes fluttered closed as my hands moved instinctively, drawing forth a tune that was neither rehearsed nor planned, but simply felt, each note wrapped around me like a warm embrace, pulling me deeper into the music's embrace. I lost myself in it. For those few minutes, grief did not define me. There was only the music, only the fragile harmony between past and present. It was as if for a fleeting moment Andrew was there listening once more, then the creak of the door broke through my reverie. My hands faltered the melody, dissolving into silence. I turned, my heart skipping. A beat, Mark stood at the entrance, his gaze steady yet gentle. His presence was unexpected. Ed, and yet in that moment, it didn't feel intrusive. If anything, it felt grounding. That was beautiful, he said softly, his voice carrying the kind of reverence reserved for something sacred. I offered a small smile, the music still lingering between. It was like an unspoken conversation. Thank you for the first time in a long time. I felt seen, not as a widow, not as a woman trapped in grief's unrelenting grasp, but simply as me. And for now that was enough. The evening unfolded like a delicate symphony, each note resonating with the unspoken tension between us. The wine, rich and velvety, warmed my veins, loosening the edges of my restraint. We talked, drifting from idle reminiscing to deeper confessions, peeling back the layers of time that had settled between. As the room, dimly lit by the flickering glow of candlelight, felt like an isolated world, just the two of us, suspended in something both ephemeral and profound. I played again, my fingers, gliding over the keys as if they belonged to someone else, as if the music had possessed me entirely. And then he felt him closer this time. Mark stood behind me, his presence a quiet force that sent shivers down my spine. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder, the weight of it neither demanding nor hesitant, but something in between, a silent question, an offering of warmth. I hadn't realized I was starved for the melody woo its way through the silence, filling the space between us with something unspoken. His breath was near his voice, almost a whisper. When he finally spoke, "You're an amazing woman," he murmured, "and you play so beautifully." The words felt heavier than they should have, laced with something deeper than admiration. It stopped playing, but the frantic rhythm of my heart only grew louder. The air between us had changed, thick with an energy that neither of us seemed ready to confront, yet unable to resist. It turned to him slowly, my pulse hammering in my throat. "Mark, I don't know what's happening." His gaze held mine, unwavering, yet filled with a quiet storm. Neither do I, he admitted, but I can't ignore this. There it was, the unspoken thing between us, given shape, given voice. Years of loneliness, of aching grief and buried longing, condensed into this one fragile moment, a single touch, a single look, and suddenly everything we had been holding back threatened to break free. The weight of it cracked something inside me, and I saw the same fracture reflected in his eyes, a tension that had lingered, unacknowledged, now unravelled with undeniable force. The world outside dissolved. There were no past regrets, no future consequences, only this moment, raw and unguarded, a moment where boundaries blurred, where restraint melted into something deeper, something inevitable. And so the night took a turn I never could have imagined. Morning came with an eerie stillness, as if the world held its breath, waiting for the weight of reality to settle. Sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting soft golden lines across the wooden floor. The room smelled faintly of coffee, warm and grounding, yet it did nothing to steady the storm inside. I found him in the kitchen, shirtless, moving through the familiar space with an ease that felt almost cruel. The coffee machine hummed softly, filling the silence between us. My nightgown lay where I had left it, a discarded whisper of the night before, a moment both too real and too ephemeral to hold on to. It turned. When he sent me there, his eyes met mine, unreadable, heavy with something unspoken. There was a fragility in there, a delicate balance between acknowledgement and denial. Claire, his voice was quiet, uncertain. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything settle into my chest. What are we supposed to do now? Mark looked down, his fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. We move on. The words sliced through me with cruel precision. They were practical, logical, but they did nothing to ease the ache in my heart. Last night had been a refuge, a stolen moment, where the weight of grief and loneliness had lifted, if only briefly. But now, in the clarity of morning, we stood at the edge of something too fragile to hold, too complicated to sustain. "This was a mistake," I whispered, forcing the words out even as something inside me rebelled against them. Mark exhaled, his gaze searching mine for something I couldn't name. Maybe it was. He paused, and for a moment something flickered across his face, regret, longing, acceptance, but for a moment it didn't feel like one. Silence stretched between us, thick with all the things we couldn't say, and then, as if by some silent agreement, we let go. He turned away, and I felt the finality of it settle into my bones. There would be no second chances, No revisiting what had been. Some things were meant to be fleeting yet, as he walked out of the room. Something inside me had already shifted some moments. Some connections, no matter how brief, change us forever.